There is a trap floating around the internet. It took me by surprise. In case you need it, I left copy pasta, so you too can break these traps. YouTube has always been my favorite surf spot. One channel I like is Vosh, who is, in a word, a so-called streamer. He is known for hosting debates with all types of characters from the dark corners of the intellectual dark web. Recently, while on YouTube, I caught a nice wave. In one of Vosh's debates, when another streamer I had never heard of, called Doug TenNapel, says,
Sure. What about woke people tend to go along with government and want a superstructure government solution to everything? So when the state tells them to do something, they're more of a conformist, compliant type and more of a bitchy type to go after other people because they're far more judgmental, as we've seen with woke culture. They're far more likely to jump in your grill than a free market conservatives. Maybe that's an explanation.
Doug tries to trap Vosh. Doug demands an explanation. How can someone so woke also support draconian, government-sponsored programs, like Medicare for All, or the Green New Deal?
I don't know what you mean, like, they like government projects, and they're judgmental and bitchy. I don't, there's like a collection, I don't know what the relationship between these characteristics are.
Doug assumes liberty only exists, in the negative sense, as a negative freedom.
Yeah, well, it's the left say that want to. I mean, I can any number of government solutions. The left is famous for wanting to expand government and have government solutions.
Doug's brand of freedom first rejects positive freedoms, where people have equity bestowed by our God-given, inalienable rights. Yet,
like what?
Like a minimum wage, like a $15 minimum wage. You're against that, right?
No, of course not.
All your woke friends are against it, right? Because that's a government overreach.
What does this have to do with a government overreach?
Well,
I think that a $15 an hour minimum wage is a good idea. You asked me for an example of a reliance on state solutions to, say, free market problems.
Eventually, Vosh responds, pointing out that not only does everyone have bias, but that they are just demonstrations of everyone's own ideology.
The right and the left are both equally okay with government overreach if it suits their interests. So the right is very pro-police, constantly telling BLM protesters that it's their fault they're getting cracked down on. They're very pro-military. And right now, a majority of the conservatives in this country are going along with Trump's effort to overturn the legitimate results of a democratic election. So I would say these are all pretty extreme examples of government overreach. Whereas with left-leaning people, like what you would call government overreach, I would just call it good policy. We're talking about stuff that can be usually pretty mathematically, empirically determined to make people's lives better.
Then, Doug switches to a new way of describing this imagined hypocrisy for the more woke among us.
Sure.
Like a minimum wage, like Medicare for all.
Judging it with a word like government overreach, I'll just call it government expansion. Because you haven't seen a government expansion quite like how they dealt with COVID.
Ultimately, Vosh's point about the government, on both the right and the left, gets to an important question of power, and especially violence. But, they never got to discuss that, because Doug went on to downplay the mortality rates of the COVID-19 virus. For someone like Doug, there is a way to ease their anxieties about this thing we call government. Listen to this interview with David Graeber about the future and society.
It's not like we're lacking for good ideas. There's probably nobody in the world, not a single person, who couldn't come up with one creative idea that neither of us would have thought of, or some creative solution to a problem none of us would have anticipated. Everybody's got something like that in them.
Of course, something like a minimum wage could go a long way in alleviating, uplifting people from their struggle just to survive. But apparently, that's too much expansion, as Doug likes to call it.
The problem is, the vast majority of people on Earth are being told to shut up every day. Nobody cares what they think. If we created a system that opens that up, who knows? And we'd have an endless deluge of potential solutions to problems. And that's what people like Peter Thiel don't recognize, that there are structures of violence telling people to shut up, because it didn't happen to them.
It is worth imagining. What if people could have more time for the creative pursuits that mark the human condition?
structures of violence.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
yeah, I mean, if you're in a situation where the only way you can support your family is to work in a factory or become a prostitute or, whatever you have to do, and you're a poor person in Indonesia, well, it is a structure of violence. If you don't do that, then you can't have food. If you try to take the food, they'll hit you.
Instead, we live in Doug's perfect world, where
there's a set of rules that couldn't exist without ultimately appealing to someone with a stick or a gun to beat you up if you break the rules.
And here, finally, is where Graeber smashes the trap Doug sets.
And as an anarchist, people ask me this all the time. They say, well, you're for the NHS, right? You're for public resources. Like, isn't that government? Well, how can you be an anarchist and be for that? And I always say, I make a distinction between institutions that could exist without violence and ones that couldn't. Any institution that could exist without ultimately being able to call up somebody with a stick or a gun to say, look, I don't care what you think, shut up and do what you're told. If you don't have recourse to that, and you can still run the organization anyway, that's fine.
Okay, and that includes NHS, what other organizations?
It's a test. We don't really know until we try. But, any sort of collective management of some resource could be organized without violence.
But Doug isn't the only one to willfully excuse all the violence surrounding everyday life. There are also the more liberal types, in all their naivety, who claim that by education, the world's problems can be solved, because knowledge is power. Graeber also takes this on. In the Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, he writes, academics love Michel Foucault's argument that identifies knowledge and power, and insists that brute force is no longer a major factor in social control. They love it, because it flatters them, the perfect formula for people who like to think of themselves as political radicals, even though all they do is write essays, likely to be read by a few dozen other people, in an institutional environment. Of course, if any of these academics were to walk into their university library, to consult some volume of Foucault, without having remembered to bring a valid ID, and decided to enter the stacks anyway, they would soon discover that brute force is really not so far away as they like to imagine. A man with a big stick, trained in exactly how hard to hit people with it, would rapidly appear to eject them.